Okay, good morning, everybody, or good evening, and welcome to the latest iteration of the Diplomat's webinar series. Today, we will be revisiting an issue that we discussed at a similar webinar event in March on the political crisis in Myanmar prompted by the military's disastrous seizure of power on February the 1st. When we last convened on this issue at the start of March, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people were marching through the streets, protesting the curtailing of the country and demanding the curtailing of the country's return to military rule. In the months since, the situation has evolved considerably. The security forces have killed hundreds, arrested thousands, and launched renewed attacks, including airstrikes against civilians in the country's ethnic minority areas. The discontent and resistance remains, but the military's repression has fragmented the mass protests into smaller gatherings, while the country is seeing increasing instances of armed resistance by newly formed People's Defense Forces. Meanwhile, and most pressingly, the Delta variant of COVID-19 has made its inexorable impact on the country, compounding the political turmoil with a profound public health emergency. 6 months on, it's clear that the military coup has failed, to bring about a smooth transition to a new period of military rule. But at the same time, the multifaceted anti-coup resistance remains very far from fulfilling its goals of reversing the coup, returning the country to democratic rule, and extricating the military from Myanmar's politics for the long term. And so to discuss how Myanmar's crisis has developed over the past 6 months and where it might be heading, we're very privileged to be joined by a distinguished panel today. We were set to be joined from Yangon by Khin Zaw Win, a longtime activist and political prisoner who currently heads the Tampadipa Institute in Yangon. He seems to have encountered some internet connection difficulties, which I suppose is a commonplace nowadays in Yangon. So if he's able to join us, he will beam in and we can revert to him when he arrives, if he does. But to begin with, we're joined by Ambassador Nicholas Coppel, who served as Australia's envoy to Myanmar from 2015 to 2018, a tenure that embraced both the great optimism that attended the historic election of November 2015, which saw the election of Aung San Suu Kyi in the National League for Democracy, and of course, the military's vicious assaults on the Rohingya of Western Myanmar in 2016 and 17. Ambassador Coppel currently serves as Assistant Professor of Practice at Monash University in Melbourne. And joining us from Singapore is Moe Thuzar, a longtime researcher at Singapore's ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. She currently serves as the co-coordinator of the Myanmar Studies Programme at the Institute and is working on a PhD dissertation about Myanmar's Cold War era foreign policy. And so before we get started, I'll just let you know a little bit about how things will proceed. First off, I'll be inviting each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes about various aspects of the political crisis unfolding in Myanmar. After that, I might pose a question or two of my own to get the discussion started, and then we can move on to a Q&A session. If you have any questions for the panelists, please enter them in the chat box in the Zoom system, and then I will choose a selection to read out during the question and answer period. And so without further ado, I'd like to call on Ambassador Coppel to kick things off by giving us a view of the international response to the coup over the past 6 months, and how he might anticipate the world will respond to this in the months to come.
Thank you, Sebastian, and it's a great pleasure to be talking with you. Yeah, the international response to the coup is an interesting case study in the practice of diplomacy. I mean, we saw from the very outset, after the coup on the 1st of February, a number of countries issuing statements of condemnation, calling for the release of political detainees, including, of course, Aung San Suu Kyi, and a restoration of democracy. UN agencies too joined in these calls, the UN Secretary General, as well as we had a statement from the United Nations Security Council. I think these various calls led to people in Myanmar expecting that the UN would somehow be able to intervene or save them. I mean, the placards, went out, and the hashtags, Save Myanmar. And before too long, people were calling, excuse me, for the responsibility to protect principle to be invoked. This quickly turned to a bit of disillusionment and indeed even some sarcasm. And as the UN was unable and the international community unable to bring about any change. And, we start seeing placards saying, 700 dead, don't worry UN, we've got 50 million more. That sort of tone of bitter disappointment, but also a tinge of humor designed to continue to attract international attention. A number of countries, and I must say it's a very small number of countries. We're talking about the United States, Canada, the European Union, and the United Kingdom have imposed targeted sanctions. And by targeted, they're targeted at the military, members of the military, and military business interests as well. But the vast majority of countries, there's almost 200 countries in the world. And so, you've got 20 odd countries that have these targeted sanctions in place. But the vast majority, including all Myanmar's neighbors and countries in the region, have not imposed any sanctions. So they don't have much bite. And of course, they're also being applied to a country and a military that's very experienced in managing and in the face of sanctions and being fairly impervious to them. So all up, the international community hasn't had much luck in bringing about change. The UN, of course, is its special envoy. The special envoy hasn't been able to even visit Myanmar. And that has led to the world turning towards ASEAN. And, what can ASEAN do? So ASEAN has held, a special meeting of its foreign ministers and of leaders and came up with a 5-point consensus, way back in April, which called for the appointment of a special envoy who would be able to facilitate some sort of dialogue. But also one of the 5 points was about establishing, if you like, a humanitarian corridor or a channel for humanitarian assistance to be provided to Myanmar. None of these points in the consensus has been implemented. We still haven't got a confirmed special envoy in place, and humanitarian assistance through AHA, the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance window, hasn't been able to deliver humanitarian assistance as envisaged. And that's not from a shortage of resources. I mean, countries like Australia have committed millions of dollars to this ASEAN window for humanitarian assistance. So it's about getting access and getting an ability to deliver that assistance, which is lacking. So in these various calls, you start to see the limits of international diplomacy. The other aspects which will be decided include this question of recognition. So a number of activists have been calling on countries to recognize the national unity government and not the military council but these calls are a little odd because certainly most countries, if not all, don't actually recognize governments. I mean, that's just not something that's done. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi's government wasn't recognized as such. I mean, you won't find a statement coming out of the United States or Europe or Australia which says, we recognize the government of the National League for Democracy in 2015 or 2016. That's just not what happens. Countries recognize states rather than governments. That said, countries do indicate their attitudes to regimes that have come to power through unconstitutional means. And they do that through, through actions such as the statements that are issued by foreign ministers and foreign ministries. They do it through the imposition of sanctions, for example. So it's a very clear statement of where a country or how a country views the developments in Myanmar. But the actual call for a recognition of NUG is just not happening. And that's not happening because not that people disagree with the intent or the spirit behind it, but it's just not the practice around the world. So there's been a lot of calls, there's call for R2P, the calls for recognition, the calls to save Myanmar. And, none of these have actually delivered anything for the people of Myanmar. And it's led to, I think, quite a degree of disillusionment within Myanmar and within the Burmese diaspora about what the world can do. And it's very understandable. I mean, there are, what it's pointing out are the limits of diplomacy. That's not to say it's all over. We still have the UN General Assemblies coming up in September. And the first question there will be one of credentials of all countries that are members of the United Nations, but in particular, they'll be looking at the question in Myanmar where there is a contested request for membership. Sorry, not for membership, but for representation. Who is going to represent Myanmar in the United Nations? And we've got two competing claims there. So the United Nations has a credentials committee, 9 members on this committee. Typically, the United States and China and Russia are 3 of those 9 members. And it'll be very interesting to see what they come up with in September when the General Assembly opens. There are a number of precedents, but there are no hard rules in the United Nations to decide questions of representation. So it's pretty much up to them to decide what they want to do. And the UN has gone in different directions and in different cases in the past. So they could go either way, either putting an emphasis on the respect for democracy and democratic rights, or reverting to what was particularly in the early days of the UN, this concept of who has effective control. In other words, which of these competing claims for representation is more likely to be able to uphold the principles of the United Nations within that country. And democracy is not one of the principles of the United Nations. The United Nations membership is about inclusivity. And so it's an open question as to which way they will go, but an interesting point to be watched. I might leave it there in terms of the international response. I'm sorry, it's not a more encouraging or positive news. And I'm very much in the school of realist or realpolitik, if you like. But I think you will see that my views are informed by decades of experience as a diplomat. And sad though it is, it's the situation in Myanmar is not going to be resolved by international actors, unless, of course, China chooses to intervene. It's going to be resolved by the people of Myanmar and the actions that they take within Myanmar. And the greatest scope for change is going to come from the military itself. Is there going to be a change of heart on the part of the senior general? I don't particularly think so. There's no sign of that. Indeed, he seems to be entrenching himself. But there too, we're seeing a fairly bleak outlook, whichever way you look at it, from an international perspective or a diplomatic perspective.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. That was your interesting comments. We seem to have been joined by Khin Zaw Win from Yangon. I think that the connection is stabilized. So I might pass the baton to him to give us a bit of a sense of the situation in Yangon on the ground at the moment, and perhaps also to offer some reflections on some of the things that Nicholas said, to the extent that you managed to hear them.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be finally connected. Good morning, everyone, and it's nice to be among friends again. The situation in Yangon is that people are very desperate. Life goes on as before, and the city is supposed to be under lockdown or shut down, but these things don't work in Myanmar. Vaccination has started. The other day, I went to one center near my house, but it was very poorly organized, and it could be, an infection trap as well. They are starting with the over 65s, but they are vaccinating only 200 a day within 2 hours. And this is the first time that, the second time the vaccination has been implemented, but it's only a drop in the bucket, and it's poorly disorganized. people are in fear, so they like to get vaccinated, but the chances are very poor. I only hope the senior citizens and the people who are living in prisons, for instance, will get vaccinated first, and well, they could get some protection. Well, that's the pandemic situation. Now, I know of many friends who have lost parents and relatives and desperately looking for medicines. Well, I can just say that if you have a full-blown case of COVID now, you know, your chances of survival are very slim. Well, I don't know about many of the hospitals, but I don't think private hospitals are within the reach of much of the population. And as I said, it's only an urban setting. It's not even, I don't see it as even being relevant to the situation. Well, the coup has been around for 6 months, and resistance is still prevails, I would say. Well, not as much as in March or April when we had the big rallies and the barricades. But now young people are having flash protests, you know, in Mandalay and in Yangon almost every day. So the mood of the country is still resistance. You know? And as Nicholas has said, in the beginning, people used to long for or wait for the UN, the responsibility to protect. I might add that nobody's talking about ASEAN now, no? And we don't have, let me be straight, any faith in ASEAN, and ASEAN has no credibility. So no matter if they appoint an envoy tomorrow or the day after, no, cross your fingers, it's not going to work. Well, the central picture is that right now negotiation is off the table, and that's what the UN is and the ASEAN is going to do. You know? And if you look for a solution, I think it's more likely that a military solution is going to be more effective rather than the political one. But the way that the junta has gone about, you know, well, it's like being an occupying army. It's not even your own national army putting down protests from young people in your own country. It's like they're acting like an army of occupation. But like I said the other day, some people are blaming them for, well, not blaming them, asserting that they are weaponizing the pandemic, you know, and withholding oxygen, withholding vaccines, you know. But it can cut both ways. The army is suffering too. So I would not discount a military solution to the whole affair. It's very sad to have to say this, and I think a lot of people are going to suffer. A lot of people are still going to die before we get anything that comes close to a resolution of the problem.
Thank you, Khin Zaw Win. So I might pass things over to Moe Thuzar now to examine the outlook for the National Unity Government, which, the official shadow government of the anti-coup forces, and perhaps also to reflect a little bit on the comments of our first two panelists.
Thank you, Sebastian. Good morning to everyone from Singapore, where I am. And it's a bit of a tough act to follow, right? I mean, I've got Ambassador Coppel and Khin Zaw Win preceding me. Let me try to bring the different strands together in addressing your question, Sebastian. I'd like to maybe, look at the task you've set me, which is to assess the outlook for the National Unity Government, maybe through three lenses, that of legitimacy or representation, the ASEAN part, and then also the broader framework of the Federal Charter and the negotiations going on with the NUCC, where the ethnic armed groups and other ethnic organizations are also represented. The coup is now 6 months on, and I think the widening armed revolt that both Ambassador Coppel and Khin Zaw Win has mentioned which is across the country, across different communities, the junta's failure to address the COVID-19 surge, which is still ongoing. And yeah, maybe to a certain extent also politicizing that. I think these all indicate that the State Administration Council is finding it challenging to assert effective control over the country and the populace, even as it dominates the foreign policy space over the national unity government, in asserting or justifying who has the right to represent the country internationally, regionally, to external interlocutors. So if we look at the NUG, the National Unity Government, I think the main legitimacy, if I could use that word there, is really by the will of the people, and the support that has been expressed by members of the international community who wish to support Myanmar's return to its democratic transition path. But as Ambassador Coppel has very rightly pointed out, the recognition of states and not governments, I think, is one nuance that, of course, many of the people in Myanmar find it challenging to wrap their heads around, as well as, I think, the assertion of who sits in the Myanmar seat at different multilateral forums. For the present moment, it is the SAC representatives who are sitting in the Myanmar seat at all the ASEAN meetings at various levels, and we are also aware. I think. I mean, I am also aware that there is a hesitancy on the part of ASEAN collectively to engage the NUG formally, or give the NUG maybe speaking space or presentation space. But informal engagement of the NUG is going on at the policy track level, the track 2 level, but not at formal meetings. And yes, both Khin Zaw Win and Ambassador Coppel have also commented on ASEAN's realistic engagement with the State Administration Council, which has occasioned much comment, and of course disappointment among people in Myanmar, as well as among international civil society groups and other members of the international community. So yes, the military is making use of the ASEAN space and the different internal positions of the various ASEAN member states to push forward its own interests for political relevance and survival, shall I say. And we've seen with the 6-month mark of the coup that the military has also tried to entrench and prolong its rule by recasting the SAC Management Committee as a caretaker government and extending the state of emergency. So I think this is something that is related to this ongoing question of whether we call it legitimacy, whether we call it recognition, or whether we call it representation. This is going to present an ongoing challenge to the NUG to assert its voice at the policy level as that essential counterpart for any kind of dialogue to take place within the context of bringing about change in Myanmar. And that brings me to the second lens that we've been looking at, which is ASEAN, because the NUG faces a challenge when it comes to engaging with ASEAN, not least because of the hesitancy by ASEAN collectively to engage with and talk to the NUG, but also within, I think, the NUG's own internal structure, decision-making process itself. How can the NUG have more strategic and effective, I think, communications with ASEAN? Right now, there is informal conversations by some individual ASEAN member states with the NUG, but not by all. And I'm not sure whether even ASEAN parliamentarians are engaging that fully with the NUG. So harking back to April, in the aftermath of the ASEAN leaders meeting on Myanmar and the 5-point consensus statement, the NUG Prime Minister Moe Thuzar issued a statement in response to that 5-point consensus, which indicated a willingness to work with ASEAN in implementing the consensus. And I think that was also aimed at setting the tone for the NUG's supporters in the broader populace to appreciate the delicacy of engaging with ASEAN, and and also to highlight where the State Administration Council was not completely being honest, to put it politely, as revealed by some of the statements made by the SAC Information Committee about how they viewed the 5-point consensus. But even with this, even with the NUG's recognition of the need to have a constructive view of the ASEAN process, its moves and its choices are also affected by public sentiment. So public sentiment in Myanmar, the two speakers before me have highlighted, there's a disappointment on the sluggishness of ASEAN diplomacy. And some members of the NUG themselves have also expressed disappointment. And, ASEAN's image, yes, it is quite low in Myanmar. People are cynical about both the UN and ASEAN being effectively able to assist them. And of course, that has, I think, fueled that determination to take things into their own hands. And so the NUG's establishment of the People's Defense Force, I think, can be seen as a good barometer of sentiment on the ground, and how the NUG faces this delicate task of balancing the many interests on the ground with the ethnic armed groups and organizations, as well as with regional and international interlocutors who will inevitably bring up the establishment of the People's Defense Force and the potential for escalation of armed revolt in the country, notwithstanding the ethical guidelines which the NUG issued quite quickly after incidents had happened that seemed to go beyond targeting just the specific aims of what the People's Defense Force was supposed to do. Which brings me to my final observation about the federal charter, the formation of the NUCC within the broad framework of the federal charter. And I think this is where the anti-junta opposition has much broader interests and aims for national reconciliation beyond the NLD's earlier, and if I could say maybe narrower vision. So I think combined, the CRPH, the NUG, the NUCC, these three entities would provide the platform, I think, for a more inclusive, consultative, decentralized form of governance in keeping with Myanmar's multi-ethnic composition. But it's also an ambitious project. It's tackling state building and peace building simultaneously, navigating fault lines that have been there since decades. And of course, I think this is where the NUG's priority would rightly lie. It would contribute to asserting the NUG status as that essential counterpart for dialogue in the ASEAN process, if and when that takes off. And so I think that political roadmap under the framework of the federal charter would present the main challenge to the narrative about the military being the only organized institution in the country. But we are seeing, of course, despite all the creative and persistent ways that the anti-coup protests have continued, despite the brutal repression and the violence and even the pandemic, despite all of this, despite all of these continuing and ongoing protests, the military is still trying to, I think, assert its control in a very brutal way. But even though it doesn't have effective control of the whole country, it's still sitting in the ruling seat. And recently, it's even tried to prolong that by recasting itself as a caretaker government. So I think the challenge for the NUG here is to show the difference of its current setup, and then continue conversations with the various ethnic armed groups in the communications consultations it has with the NUCC. And it's important because we need to avoid the inevitable comparison with past parallels of alternative governments, the NCGUB and the NCUB in the aftermath of the 1990 elections in Myanmar. And of course, for the Generation Z who are now training in urban warfare, right now in the quote unquote liberated areas along the border, I think they should also not be drawn as parallels for the former students' democracy groups like the ABSDF. So from what I know, from what I'm aware, the NUG is in conversation with several ethnic armed organizations, the Karen National Union, the Chin National Front, the Kachin Independence Organization, primarily through their interim coordination team for all the Kachin armed organizations. The new Bonsate parties in some instances, and I think also with the Shans with RCSS. I think it's important to note also about the NUG's overtures or the NUG's attempts to establish conversations with the Arakan Army, the AA leadership in Rakhine. I think it's important to note that while being supportive of the anti-junta movement and the idea of the national unity government, the Arakan Army has also clearly stated that it's not interested to join in all these discussions. It's really sticking to its priority of looking after the safety and security of the people in Rakhine. So I think here NUG's best bet might really, again, to repeat, to show how it's different from how the state administration council members continually refer back to old playbooks. So I think the NUG cabinet meetings will have to continue to set that collective direction and internal policy cohesion, which is important for further developing the NUG's strategies and approaches to external and domestic interactions. And of course, the ongoing challenge there in doing all of this is the imperative to develop the necessary human resources and capacity for the support staff of the various NUG ministries. I mean, I can say right now, there is goodwill and support for assisting the NUG in its policy capacity. We can look at the Rohingya policy that was issued in early June. That's a good illustration, as are the responsible investment policy issued in July, and most recently, the formation of the COVID-19 task force. But again, without actual control of the organs of state power and the current situation of being a government in hiding or exile, I think hampers the NUG's agility. And we've talked about whether the COVID-19 emergency can provide the much needed impetus for the international community, for ASEAN to get a humanitarian assistance initiative going for Myanmar. And I think it's an important consideration because, as Khin Zaw Win has highlighted, Myanmar's COVID-19 emergency can also affect regional stability. So I think we need to look at how the international community could also engage or work with ASEAN based on the 2008 Cyclone Nargis example of ASEAN and the United Nations working together to achieve a breakthrough to the then military regime, and then working out a modus operandi with moderates in the government for technical coordination of assistance on the ground. So the lessons from the past are there and their working experience is there. But the difference today is, of course, I think the concern that people are now having with who do we work with, when it comes to humanitarian assistance in Myanmar. So I think, yes, we need to consider even more creative ways of getting humanitarian assistance to the Myanmar people. The NUG's COVID-19 response strategy is a good start, but it cannot effectively reach the swathes of people in the heartlands, in the main cities and towns, and the Western regions and states. So how do we help, push that response strategy even further? And of course, all of this, maybe in closing, it's important to note the caveat, where I've been talking about all of this. We all tend to talk about all of these entities as monolithic entities, whether it's the international community, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's NUG, the NUCC, the CRPH, but they're not monolithic entities. They are different individual interests to consider, particularly when it comes to, I think, trying to work out that broader dialogue going on under the NUCC process in redefining what redefining what the country's future should be with the inclusion of all the multiple actors from the ethnic organizations. I'll stop here and maybe continue the conversation during the general discussion and question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mo. Well, before we go to the Q&A, I think I'd like to ask our other two panelists to reflect on some of the things that Mo said at the end there. The challenge of providing humanitarian support to Myanmar. I mean, COVID is running out of control in the country, in addition to the political turmoil that has engulfed the country since the coup. And we've had UN officials calling for, an unprecedented international intervention of some kind to address these issues. At the same time, a lot of these same officials and organizations are also calling on outside countries not to recognize or deal with the military junta. Is it possible to do these two things at once? Is it possible to provide the humanitarian aid that Myanmar needs while avoiding sort of conferring some sort of inadvertent legitimacy on the military government? Or are there ways to deal with the military government in a practical sense that don't that stop short of sort of an endorsement of its rule? Perhaps Khin Zaw Win, you could offer some thoughts, and then we can go to Ambassador Coppel for some comments after that.
Thank you, Sebastian. That's a good question. When I said earlier about the let's say shortcomings of the UN and the ASEAN, I didn't include this ability to provide much needed humanitarian aid. Well, to give you a straight answer, yes, it can be done and it should be done. Well, the people, the resources, the funds are already in Myanmar. Yeah. Well, some ongoing projects have been curtailed for the moment, but humanitarian assistance programs can be started tomorrow if they wanted to. Last 2 weeks, we saw some UN convoys go up to Mindat, provide some aid. But the convolutions you mentioned, the arguments of whether to cooperate, I think for the UN, it doesn't matter very much. You just need the, let's say, the organization or the corporate will to do it. Myanmar is a UN member. Sure, there'll be difficulties, but providing this kind of aid should not be cause for hampering or obstructing any of that aid. Now, the COVID vaccine that I mentioned is only a small, it's only a drop in the bucket it's only a small amount, but we need much more. Medical supplies, especially food, especially in those remote areas. Well, I think the feeling at the back of everyone's minds in the country is that, what is the UN doing? They can do it right now if they want to. I think they better back up and get the political will. I don't think that argument about dealing with the junta or not dealing with the junta really counts. That's my opinion.
Ambassador Coppel, do you have some comments to make on that?
Yeah, thank you. I'd make several comments. One is to agree with Moe Thuzar that the UN isn't a monolithic organization. There are UN agencies which are engaged in Myanmar today and are providing humanitarian assistance. I mean, the World Food Programme foremost among them. But other UN agencies don't have that same level of acceptance, if you like, by the junta, and have difficulty in providing their ongoing programs and assistance in Myanmar. So the UN needs to work through and with the organizations that do have that entry into the country. World Food Programme, of course, is concerned with nutrition and food and the provision of things like medical assistance and oxygen and vaccination programs, is one which you would normally look to the World Health Organization, for example. But there needs to be some flexibility there. I would agree also with Khin Zaw Win that, I don't think it's for people outside the country to say, we are going to hold the people of Myanmar hostage, and we're not going to provide humanitarian assistance because that would involve having some sort of contact or dealing or some degree of legitimization of the junta. you know, if you need to provide humanitarian assistance, and that is if that then is the priority, you need to work with whoever's controlling the airspace, whoever is controlling the airports and the landing rights. If you want a military aircraft or other aircraft to be landing with supplies, you're going to have some contact and dealings with them. And when you have a crisis, an emergency, which is involving the potential loss of thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of lives, to say, oh, but we don't want to legitimize the regime, and so we're not going to talk to them about getting landing rights. I think that's a moral failure.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've got a couple of questions about the potential for the ethnic armed organizations and the People's Defense Forces to, threaten the military's hold on power. I wondered if, our panelists could reflect on that question. In military terms, could an alliance of these organizations and groups pose a threat to, the Tatmadaw's hold on power?
Well, I'll go first then. Okay. Now, there are a couple of points, even more, that you have to factor in if you want to discuss that question. Number one, the Myanmar armed forces are not as big as is assumed. 350,000, 450,000. They don't have that numbers. I think they are inflated. There was a very good talk given by the ISEAS Society in New York, which said that at the most they have only 100,000 men. And this time, let me make this clear, in the 70-odd years of Myanmar's independence, the Myanmar armed forces have made a huge blunder. The dimensions of this blunder cannot be plumbed at this moment, cannot be quantified. But they've turned the entire country against them. It's not only the urban centers, it's the ethnic states, even the Burman heartlands. Sometimes you wonder if the military mind in Myanmar especially really understands the military and the political ramifications of this. And well, some people dismiss the PDF. The PDF is not monolithic, and it's only under the nominal commands of the NUG. There are some Western diplomats, I have to say, who say that, no, we cannot deal with the PDF because they are engaged in terrorist organizations. Why don't they say this to the military troops as well, who are shooting up and rampaging the whole country? I mean, this kind of argument doesn't work, I'm sorry to say. See? So that's why I said at the beginning, it's more likely that we will have a military solution, because the Myanmar army is not, well, it still is cohesive at the officer corps level, but it has lost the people's support. And even if they can buy any amount of arms from Russia and from India, well, I don't think technology is central to their situation, to the issue now. So I think it's a matter of time. Well, they're talking about, Myanmar is talking 2 years from now, August 2023. A lot of things can happen in between. A lot of things can happen, and I'm not very sure if the military can last as a single cohesive entity until then. That's my opinion.
Thanks, Mo. Nicholas, do you have anything to add to that?
I would agree with Khin Zaw Win about the military. I think right now what's holding the military, at least the top echelons, together is this collective fear. But we are seeing so many defections from the ranks, and I think the COVID pandemic raging, it has also raged through the rank and file and affected many of the members of the military in a way that I think this will also be imprinted in their psyche about what was or was not done for bringing a timely response to them as well. So I think that's one thing that we need to bear in mind when we talk about the military also not being a monolithic entity. But I think linking back to the question about, whether the PDFs or the EAOs, can pose that final push to the military, so to speak. Let's just consider the status of the ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar, and for how long has the civil war been going on in terms of the conflict in the ethnic areas. I mean, that's been going on for more than 7 decades. So I think this is where people like Khin Zaw Win and myself would have problems whenever people start applying this broad term of civil war to the current situation in Myanmar. I mean, we've been living with this civil war. And if you look at which are the ethnic armed groups that have actually posed the most resistance to the military over all these decades, it's groups like the Karen National Union, it's groups like the Kachin Independence Army under the Kachin Independence Organization. And these are the entities that are offering training to the young protesters who've gone to these liberated areas. These are the main ethnic armed groups that have presented the most challenge to the military forces post February the 1st, when fighting started again, notwithstanding the ceasefire overtures that the State Administration Council had offered a couple of times. So I think we need to kind of like look at these things as in how do we then try to find a common interest and build on that common interest? For right now, everyone's common interest is to really oppose the coup and of course oppose the military and the brutal force that is exerting across the country. But beyond that, towards that the kind of federal union that people want to see emerging out of this revolution, the armed revolt. I think that's where the crux of the matter of negotiations and discussions among the different interest groups need to continue, and really need to look at what's the vision beyond getting the military in its current form out of the seat of power.
All right, thank you. Nicholas, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think the point I would make is that the People's Defence Forces and the ethnic armed groups, the chances of them becoming unified are less than the chances of ASEAN becoming unified. Mm-hmm. And even if they were, I don't think a traditional, if you like, counter-military force to the Tatmadaw, Myanmar's military, is the way is likely to bring about change in Myanmar. I think the only change that's possible in Myanmar can be done by the military themselves. I mean, ultimately, it's going to have to be, a new constitution which the military are comfortable with, and only the military will decide that. I think if there is to be a successful challenge to the coup, it's going to come from an individual or a small group of individuals. There's a lone wolf, if you like, who take matters into their own hands, and then that leading to a alternative, more sympathetic leadership of the Tatmadaw, who then see that it's in the interests of the country for there to be a new construct within Myanmar. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I don't see a traditional grouping of ethnic armed groups and PDFs taking on a traditional military conflict being successful. I think if there is to be change, it's going to come through a more random event.
Thanks. We have a question here from Linda Yar of George Washington University asking about civil society and public support for the National Unity Government and the anti-coup resistance in other parts of ASEAN. And I think this touches on the phenomenon of the Milk Tea Alliance, this sort of transnational solidarity network that is beginning to form between pro-democracy activists in various parts of the region. And you can see this just, the transmissions from these groups in the gestures and tactics that the Myanmar protesters have used. And I guess the question, I suppose the question to the panel is, and I might extend Linda's question slightly, is, how significant is this form of solidarity to the anti-coup struggle in Myanmar, and how do you see, how significant do you think this will be in the months and years to come? Who wants to take it first? Any of Mo?
I guess yeah, Khin Zaw Win is letting me go first. I think yes. It's really any kind of support expressed right now to the resistance, of course, has that tremendous, I think, moral impact. There's a moral boost. But it's also quite relevant here to reflect on what both Khin Zaw Win and Ambassador Coppel have observed about change coming from within. It really, I think, is the internal dynamics and encouragement fueling the resistance movement as well. I would also say that the civil society, popular support and interest in what's happening in Myanmar and the resistance to the coup has also been affected by the own internal challenges and exigencies in each of the countries in the region with the resurgence in the COVID-19 pandemic. And in certain cases, in some countries, in the context of the pandemic, we've also seen a reluctance to host refugees or migrants from Myanmar, or we hear pronouncements about the influx of migrants being a potential challenge for other countries' systems. Especially, I guess, in the context of a potential humanitarian space opening up along the Thai-Myanmar border. I think that's also something that it's not only the civil society and popular support, but what will the governments of other ASEAN countries where such humanitarian spaces could open up, what would they view and how would their views be on such responses? So I think there is interest, there is support if it comes to the civil society, if it comes to public interest, but also because people are caught up in their own challenges related to the pandemic. It's also very much a question of, yes, what else can we do? And the difficulties of getting assistance cross-border, or even trying to assist or facilitate financial cash transfers to Myanmar. I think there are all the attendant challenges to I think getting these informal forms of civil society support and assistance that it's not a coordinated effort in any way, but I think anything that does coalesce in the humanitarian space that has existed along the Thai-Myanmar border in the past, and I think which is kind of right now re-emerging. So yeah, have I missed out anything?
Rundown.
Oh, all right. If you guys are good, I can go to the probably one final question before we wrap up. This is a question about ASEAN's potential, or the potential of individual ASEAN nations to potentially spearhead the beginning, the reopening of dialogue of some kind in Myanmar, in the absence of a unified ASEAN effort. Do any of you see potential on this front, particularly from, say, the Indonesians who have been leading the effort to push forward a resolution to the crisis? Khin Zaw Win, do you want to make some comments first, and maybe we can go to Ambassador Coppel?
Yes. I think I should have brought this up in an earlier question about the role of China. While China has let ASEAN have first go, but it's also observing the situation closely. I think it's just a matter of time before China will just have to step in. It's trade and investments, and even the safety of Chinese nationals in Myanmar are being threatened. And of course, Indonesia. I must state this quite emphatically. I'm very grateful to the initiatives that are shown by Indonesia. On just yesterday, on Monday, I read what the ASEAN foreign minister has said about the appointment of a special envoy and asking Myanmar to accept that. I think it's also like you could even say, who steps in first? Will it be Indonesia first or will it be China? And those are the two really front contenders for it. And I would say both have a good chance, and also public support, institutional support. I wish them luck. And I think it's much better that they go there individually and bilaterally rather than waiting for something collectively like ASEAN or the UN.
If I could comment, I think Indonesia acting unilaterally out of frustration with slow progress from ASEAN itself. I don't think it as an individual country has the leverage over Myanmar. And indeed, acting unilaterally might, in the sense that it creates division and split within ASEAN, might actually serve the interests of the junta. I agree with Khin Zaw Win. The one country that does have influence over, or potential influence over Myanmar is China. China provides protection in the United Nations and the Security Council, protection against mandated sanctions and other resolutions that would be hostile to the junta. But China also has its commercial interests, its Belt and Road initiatives, the pipelines and highways which connect it to the Bay of Bengal. It's got a land border of around 2,000 kilometers. It's got extensive trade and investment interests as well. So China has a lot at stake in Myanmar, and it needs and wants peace and stability on its border regions. It doesn't, however, have a history of diplomatic activism in terms of resolving or contributing to the resolution of conflicts in other countries. China's international actions have always been about its own interests and seems fairly indifferent about what happens in the rest of the world. This is what they call non-interference. But as Khin Zaw Win said, China does have a lot of its nationals in Myanmar and a lot of its commercial interests. And if they were to be at risk, I think that might be a catalyst for a more considered approach by China. We haven't seen signs of it yet, but it is the one country which does have the influence which might bring about some change in Myanmar. And Indonesia, I agree, fully support what they're doing, fully support their activism and trying to push ASEAN towards something. But on its own, I'm afraid I don't see it as being successful. That's not to say it shouldn't go about what it's doing. I fully support that. But is it going to be successful? Doesn't have the same prospects as something if China were to do it.
Moe, do you have something to add to that before we wind up?
Yeah, I think earlier on when I was trying to comment and assess the response to the Rohingya crisis of 2017, I had suggested then that an ASEAN response doesn't necessarily mean all the 9 countries agreeing and then going in together as a main force. It can also mean different ASEAN members working with the authorities in Myanmar on specific projects and so on that can have an impact on the ground. Of course, with the Rohingya situation, I think the focus was then, of course, on repatriation and less on, I think, looking really at what were the root causes and how do we help the reintegration of the communities. So there has been a big awakening since then. But just to go back to the current situation and to also add on to Ambassador Coppel and Khin Zaw Win's comments, there is every possibility for ASEAN member states to take unilateral action under the ASEAN framework. And then, of course, try to focus on where their strengths or their expertise can be best can best serve the people of Myanmar.
All right, thank you. Well, I mean, I'm sure we could go on for another hour or two. There's many angles to this multifaceted political situation in Myanmar, but I'd like to thank our three panelists for their insights and the illuminating discussion we've had today. Yes, thank you all for attending. And we'll be back with another webinar shortly. Keep an eye on our website, thediplomat.com, for any announcements of future events. And yes, thank you all for attending again.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
Stefan,
conversation.
for organizing this. I enjoyed being on this panel.